I'm Vivienne Benesch, Producing Artistic Director of PlayMakers Repertory Company, and I'm thrilled to welcome you to the fifth episode of our PlayMakers Keeping You Company series, Think Like an Actor, with the one and only Ray Dooley. As many of you are coming back, I think possibly for the fifth time, I don't need to remind you that Ray has been with us here for over 30 years and over 100 productions as one of the great luminaries of the stage at PlayMakers, in the classroom at UNC, and throughout the Greater Triangle community. And now, unsurprisingly, he is a star of our virtual platforms. Speaking of virtual, we are just about ready to start our streaming virtual season, which we have titled All Too Human. With the world in the state that it is, we thought that All Too Human was a perfect expression of what theater does best, which is reflect our shared humanity back at ourselves. And that is very much still possible, and in some ways even more necessary in the virtual medium that we find ourselves in. We're kicking off the season next week with an exciting encore presentation of Kane Smigo's poetic, timely, pulsing, just wonderful Temples of Lung and Air. Individual tickets as well as season passes are on sale now. And for all the details, you can visit playmakersrep.org/human. Now, if you missed any of our previous episodes of Think Like an Actor, you can view them anytime on our YouTube channel. We have placed the link in the chat, and you can also go to our website at any time and find them there. Ray spent the first 3 lessons taking us through different parts of Hamlet. And last month, we dipped our toes into the comedy Twelfth Night. Tonight, Ray will continue his turn investigating the humor and humanity of Malvolio with the famous letter scene. And if you'd like to follow along, the text of the scene will be in your chat. Speaking of the chat, most of you know this, but while you can't speak to us directly, please do use the chat at the bottom of your box, of the bottom of your screen, to send in any questions you might have. You can do this at any point during the class, and when Ray is done, I will use those questions to facilitate a short Q&A with Ray when he's done. So without further ado, it's my great privilege to pass this off to my dear, dear friend and colleague, the very wondrous Ray Dooley.
Thanks, Viv.
Thank you.
Bye.
Take it away.
All right. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for being back and for the warm reception that these talks have received. So glad you're with us this evening. We are looking again, speaking of All Too Human, at Shakespearean comedies, which, if anything, get at our common humanity in all of its aspects. And we'll be returning to Twelfth Night. A quick review of where we were last week. We started with a wide angle, and we talked about why Shakespeare's comedies, unlike many others of his contemporaries, and even down through the ages, seem not to be so useful for making, say, a sitcom. That there was a sense of a beginning, a middle, and end, an arc of a story, which was to us on a very deep level satisfying in a deeply human way. Oftentimes we start in an ordered environment, say the town in Athens in Midsummer Night's Dream, and then people, usually young people, find their way out into what we call the green world, following the great Canadian critic Northrop Frye's idea, where adventures happen, and then eventually, having learned and changed in that green world, they returned to the ordered world, where there is usually either a dance or music signifying a restoration of order, with a baton passed in many cases to the younger generation. And we see this in The Forest of Arden, in As You Like It, and in Two Gentlemen of Verona, and all the way into the late romances, like Cymbeline, where Imogen goes to out into the woods and then returns, or the plot is resolved. So what Shakespeare is doing is something that we might call archetypal. he's writing in a structure that is a very deep pattern in our collective consciousness. Those of you who remember Joseph Campbell's book, Hero with a Thousand Faces, made popular this idea of an archetypal journey. Now, in two of the plays, the so-called C comedies, Twelfth Night and The Tempest, this green world takes place, the entire action of the play takes place in the green world. Viola washes up from a shipwreck in Illyria. What should I do in Illyria, she asks. And this is where remarkable adventures happen to her. And we said too that Shakespeare was tapping into, in these plays, something that has to do with seasonal festivals, which we still can see vestiges of, particularly in England, but all over. Seasonal fertility rites like the Maypole festivals, and that we still see vestiges of these, the return of the light at the New Year, Christmas time, and that these are, the rhythms of these are built into his plays as well. And one of the factors there is this idea of the Lord of Misrule, that during this festive season, festive period of time, everything is turned topsy-turvy. And those who are usually banished for their bad behavior are welcomed in. We can think of what we used to call house party weekends at college and that kind of thing, where revelry, shall we say, was appropriate, but then had to be put away. So too in Shakespeare, we see that. The great Lord of Misrule, of course, Falstaff, in Henry IV, parts 1 and 2, who teaches the young Prince Hal how to be truly alive in all aspects of his personality, but then of course has to be put away at the end of part 2 when Hal becomes King Henry V, because that's appropriate for him having grown up. He puts away that earlier part of his life. So we're heading now for Twelfth Night, where we see, of course, Sir Toby Belch, the great Lord of Misrule, here in our household, on a much smaller scale, a household scale here in Illyria. So that was the widest thing, the widest lens we had. Then we came down to our particular production in 2018, or I think it was 2018, but 2017 it was, which was set in the south of France in the 1950s. So if you're thinking like an actor and you're playing Malvolio in that, you wonder, without making too much of a meal of it, so who is this guy? Always a good question to ask if you're thinking like an actor, who is this guy? So if he's a certain age, when was he born? Okay, and he lives in the France, so he's in Europe during, World War II. Okay, fair enough. How did he get through World War II and end up as the head butler, more or less the steward, in this private home on the Riviera, essentially? So then, I mentioned this idea that I worked through, that Malvolio had been an apprentice to Mr. Gustav H. In Wes Anderson's great film, The Grand Budapest Hotel, and that he had hoped to become a member of the Society of the Crossed Keys, of the great hotel concierges. But Mr. Gustav recognized that Malvolio was lacking in his humanity. And he was, sorry, I get a little weepy. Whoa, hello. Yeah, the good stuff never leaves you. And that Mr. Gustav essentially washed him out of concierge school. And so Malvolio, who had met Olivia's father at the hotel, signed on to become the steward, traveled back to the south of France from the Grand Budapest Hotel to become the steward of the household, a much less prestigious job. And so you always ask, as you're thinking as an actor, why does this person behave the way they do? And Malvolio in particular, so bitter, so haughty, so of a sense that life has done him this great injustice and that he deserves so much more than this state he finds himself in this house. So what that did for me as an actor gave me a visual framework of the Grand Budapest Hotel that I had seen, that life with a fabulous people coming and going, and Mr. Gustav, who had done me dirt, and I was going to show him. And so I'm going to show him by marrying the daughter of the house, who is now in charge of the house. Okay, so that's the setup to where we are. So tonight we're going to continue from where we left off last time. You recall that Malvolio has been off, as they say, posing to his own shadow in the sun. And he's been talking about how it's all fortune and it's just luck, and that my lady or Maria once told me, my lady did affect me. And he fantasizes this scene of being married to Olivia and how he was going to get his comeuppance with all the people who now rightfully are beneath him. So he is, in our production, I was going about the drinks cart and setting it up and having this fantasy. Meanwhile, Sir Toby, Sir Andrew Aguecheek, who is visiting and is Sir Toby's dupe, and we'll talk more about that in a minute, and who's giving Sir Toby a lot of money because he thinks he's going to get to marry Olivia. And a new character named Fabian, who appears to be a gardener or somebody who works on the estate, a very solid guy who eventually at the end of the play delivers a beautiful speech that attempts to make peace with everybody. But we meet Fabian. And so Maria, the maid, has written a note to entrap Malvolio in his own weakness of self-love. Oh, you are too full of self-love, Malvolio, says Olivia at one point. So they're going to play on his human weakness, all too human, to trap him because he has been really nasty to all three of the rest, all of the rest of the household. Very, very unpleasant person. So they're going to get their revenge. So she's written a note, folded it up, and as we see, she's folded it and then sealed it with sealing wax and a ring, which she's borrowed from, or a seal that she's borrowed from Olivia. And her handwriting, the setup is that it is nearly indistinguishable from Olivia's handwriting. And she's left it on the set, or on the floor of the set. Now Malvolio suddenly, and here's where we're going to pick up the text. And I'm going to be working from, we want to give our attributions, I'm going to be working from my version of the text, which this particular book I bought for our 1992 production, and then used again in 2017. And it is the Arden text. And for those who are real Shakespeare aficionados, Arden has just finished their third full edition of all of Shakespeare's plays, one at a time. The first edition started in the 1890s. The second, and was done by around 1920. The second edition was mid-century, and the third full edition of Shakespeare's plays with some additions just was finished with a new measure for measure out. So good job, Ardens. I prefer these for their notes, and particularly their notes on the different versions of the play that were there. We have, to review, the folio text, which was in the 1623 hardback, as we might say, and the quarto text, which was sort of we could think of it useful enough as a paperback that had come out, and they're different. And so as an actor, when you're thinking like an actor, you want to know what was in each of those texts so that you have the choice of saying the thing that is most useful. So Malvolio I'll be working from this text, and it may be different, in fact, from what you're seeing. And the reason for that is that we would have different editors. So bear with me with that. So in my text, I have Malvolio, and there's a stage direction, seeing the letter, which an editor put in. It's not in the folio edition. And he says, what employment have we here? Employment meaning, what's this thing? Fabian then says, now is the woodcock near the gin. So the woodcock is the first of the animal references to Malvolio. And we've just had one earlier before he comes on. Here comes the trout that must be caught with tickling. So he's been called a trout that they're going to catch by tickling the line, as they're doing. And now he's a woodcock. And a woodcock at that time was known as a particularly foolish bird, kind of a not very smart bird. And the gin is the trap. So now is the bird near the trap. And Sir Toby says, oh, peace. So the comic setup is that the audience sees the three people who are overhearing. And of course, Malvolio does not hear them, although the audience does. And in our production from 2017, the guys were, it was played very broadly, shall we say, which included a movie camera for one of the characters. And that is part of the comic hilarity. And to use the other term we talked about for the title of tonight's play, the ridiculousness of it. And the more over-the-top ridiculous it is, the funnier it is. So Sir Toby says, oh, peace. And the spirit of humors intimate reading aloud to him. So why do we have to have this line? Well, Malvolio would normally just pick it up and read it quietly. Shakespeare, in a kind of public way, is invoking or giving permission for the theatrical convention of Malvolio reading aloud. He's letting the audience know what the ground rules for the scene are going to be. So then Malvolio, and I have a stage direction that says taking up the letter, but as we see, it may be worth going down to the letter. And on the cover of the letter is a superscription. And he looks at it and he says, by my life, this is my lady's hand. And by hand, of course, we mean penmanship, handwriting. And he looks at it and he says, these be her very C's, her U's, and her T's. And thus makes she her great P's. It is, in contempt of question, her hand. So we'll take that last sentence first. It is, one would be foolish to even say it wasn't. In contempt of question, out of the question that it's not her hand. Okay, then you're playing Malvolio, you've got to deal with what the heck does this mean? These be her very C's, her U's, and her T's. Why that? And then notice the next line. Sir Andrew Aguecheek says, her C's, her U's, and her T's. Why that? So this becomes a very interesting puzzle for the actor playing Malvolio, because we want to at least know what the joke is and understand that. Okay. First thing is that we immediately notice that there are no C's or P's in the phrase, to the unknown beloved, this and my good wishes. So as an actor, we're always trying to build a web of coherence, of credibility for ourselves. So a way of solving that is that there are two sentences on the front cover, and Malvolio reads only one of them. So I forget which sentence I imagined was also there, but it had the missing letters. But then what are we dealing with this CUTP? Okay. The word cut has a plethora of meanings. If we look deep into the Oxford English Dictionary, which is where we go, remember this is the Dictionary on Historical Principles, and tells us what words meant at particular times, we find, and I'm going to read this note, in it is this, the cut can be a verb, it can be a noun, and it can have many meanings there. So in the second noun meaning, subheading Roman numeral 4, note 21b, we learn that cut can mean a narrow passage for water, a strait, a water gap. Okay, fair enough. So a narrow passage for water. And it so happens, the Oxford English Dictionary tells us, that a scatological, biological connection was made in a play earlier in 1589 that, shall we say, we're dealing in the realm of junior high school humor here. And we still hear the word cut used as a gap in rocks. Archie Fisher's, the great Scottish folk singer, song, The Witch of the Westmoreland, through the cut of the Kirkstone Pass, the winding water lay. When we see through the cut in the rock, the water beyond. This is a song from probably 40 years ago, 50 years ago. So we then, if we put that in our minds and we say, these be her C's, her U's, and her T's, and thus makes she her great P's. So P there either has to do with penmanship or bodily function. And Shakespeare, so why is Shakespeare putting this on here? And why does Sir Andrew repeat that? Okay. A reasonable guess might be that Shakespeare, who remember is writing for both the most educated people in his town, there in London, but also the groundlings, who, as we learn in Hamlet, are capable of nothing but inexplicable dumb shows and noise. So Shakespeare was not above bawdiness and scatological reference to amuse that section of his audience that would find, say, junior high school humor funny. So the audience would get this Bawdy reference, scatological reference, but Malvolio doesn't get it. So what this does theatrically is it makes Malvolio ridiculous. Almost as if, what would be our, maybe something like putting, back in junior high when the sign "kick me" got put on somebody's back, and they would walk down the hall and everybody would laugh at them because they didn't know what was on their back. And so too here, Malvolio does not get the joke. And so he becomes ridiculous in the eyes of the audience, which keeps, to some degree, keeps the play, because of the cruelty of this joke that eventually gets played on him, it keeps the play in the realm of comedy and not in the realm of pathos, where we start to feel sorry for him. And then so interesting, then Sir Andrew also clearly doesn't get the joke, right? And Shakespeare intentionally writes Sir Andrew, her C's, her U's, her T's. Why that? Shakespeare is, in this way, tying those two characters together as, well, we'll use the word he also uses about both of these characters. And that word is gull, which of course is another bird reference. But it's also, it means dupe. And right after Malvolio leaves, here comes my noble gull catcher, says Sir Toby as Maria comes up. And then at the very end, when Sir Toby rejects Sir Andrew and his ineffectual being, he says, will you help me, you gull? And he calls him several other things. But Shakespeare is clearly tying these two men together, Sir Andrew and Malvolio. Sir Andrew, who is the dupe of Sir Toby, because he can't see or is willfully blind about what Sir Toby, how much advantage Sir Toby is taking of him, and Malvolio, who is really the dupe of himself, who is blinded by his own self-love. So they are both dupes or gulls. And this is how Shakespeare ties those two characters together. And the audience is laughing at both of them for not getting the scatological joke that is happening here. So, okay. So Malvolio then is reading the superscription. To the unknown beloved, this and my good wishes. And this is the phrase in which there is no C or no P. To the unknown beloved, this and my good wishes. Her very phrases. By your leave, wax. So he turns over and he is about to break the seal to look and see. So he's going to read, he doesn't know who this is to, and he's going to read somebody else's mail, right? So this is another character, shall we say, flaw that Mr. Gustav may have picked up earlier on in Malvolio's life. And he says soft. And in Shakespeare, of course, soft means something like wait. Hamlet says, soft you now, the fair Ophelia. But wait, something up. He goes, soft. And the impressure, her Lucrece, with which she uses to seal. What does that mean? It means that the wax, the impressure on the wax, is from a stamp. It's probably not a ring in this case, although it is, as we know in Hamlet, when the same question occurs. But it's a stamp, and Maria has borrowed the stamp and closed it up with the seal that Olivia normally would use. And it's a picture of Lucrece or Lucretia, who with the knife takes her own life after what happens to her in Roman mythology. Soft, and the impressure, her Lucrece, with which she uses to seal. There's another, this sealing, idea of sealing, also in Twelfth Night, when Viola says, how easy is it for the proper false in women's waxen hearts to set their forms. And what that means is, how easy is it for a good-looking but false guy to set his form in, as she says, women's waxen hearts. She's saying that a woman's heart is like wax, and a proper false man can set his impressure there. How easy is it, says Viola. So this image of wax and sealing is very prevalent in Shakespeare. Okay, to seal, 'tis my lady, to whom should this be? He opens the letter. And Fabian says, this wins him, liver and all. Why liver? In this cosmology of this time, the liver, the heart, and the brain are the three seats in the body. And the liver is the seat of the lower passions, the animal passions, if you will. So not only is he curious, but now he's going to be one all the way through. Jove knows I love, but who? Lips do not move. No man must know. And then he looks at Malvolio after reading this. He looks up at, now probably playing to the audience. In the convention, the theatrical vocabulary of the scene, He now plays this to the audience as his sounding board. And he says, no man must know what follows. The numbers altered. What does that mean? Numbers in Shakespeare means poetry, because each line of poetry has a certain number of syllables or a certain meter, we would say. In Hamlet, when he says, "Oh, Ophelia," in the note that Ophelia shows her father, "Oh, Ophelia, oh dear Ophelia, I am ill at these numbers." It doesn't mean I'm feeling sick at this time. It means I'm no good at writing poetry. Yeah? So the numbers altered. In other words, it's a different verse form, and it is. I may command where I adore, but silence, like a Lucrece knife, with bloodless stroke my heart doth gore. MOAI doth sway my life. At which point, while Malvolio is still looking at the paper, Fabian says, a fustian riddle. Fustian meaning stuffed, well stuffed, meaning, oh, she's really stuffed this full of good things. And Sir Toby agrees, excellent wench, say I. MOAI doth sway my life. Malvolio asks the audience. And then he says, nay, but first, let me see. And he goes back to reading. What a dish of poison hath she dressed him? And with what wing, says, Fabian says, what a dish of poison hath she dressed him? In other words, using the image of bait, poisoned bait. And Sir Toby says, and with what wing the Staniel, Staniel, checks at it. Now, here's one of our text differences. In the folio, the word is stallion. With what a wing the stallion checks at it. Doesn't make a lot of sense, and looking at Malvolio as a stallion doesn't seem quite right. Staniel is another word for a bird of prey. And so we have another bird metaphor. So this is going to be a preferred reading for us. And because this idea, with what wing the Staniel checks at it, you can imagine a bird of prey sailing along, and then it senses prey, and it checks with a wing. With what a wing the Staniel checks at it, and it's going to dive on its prey. Okay, so we see here Shakespeare using, as he always does, all these examples from nature: birds, flowers, the day, the seasons, always images from nature. And of course, at this time, because people spent more time in nature and had less other things to distract them, there were many, many, many more words for the natural world than we have now. It's one of the great rewards of working in Shakespeare, is to learn about flowers and animals and all of these things. So Malvolio is reading again. I may command where I adore. Why, she may command me. I serve her. She is my lady. There is no obstruction in this. This is evident to any formal capacity. In other words, anybody with half a brain would see that that follows, that I'm still in the running here. In the end, what should that alphabetical position portend? If I could make that resemble something in me, softly, M-O-A-I. Now again, the audience, of course, is realizing, the audience is ahead of him, and he's looking ridiculous again, because he can't quite work it out that M-O-A-I sort of sounds like Malvolio could, right? So he hasn't figured that out yet, but of course the audience knows. So again, he's ridiculous. And Sir Toby says, oh, I make that up. He is now at a cold scent. In other words, oh, look at him beating his brains fruitlessly. But again, notice it's a reference about a dog. A cold scent, a dog following a trail, and he's hit a cold scent. Fabian, who may know something about dogs, he says, Souter will cry upon for all this, though it be as rank as a fox. And if ever there was a line that almost always gets cut in Twelfth Night, it's this one. What? Okay, Souter is like what we would say Rover or Fido. It's a generic name for a dog, okay? And in this case, it's a dog who is following a scent. So even though this clue is as rank as a fox, in other words, any reasonable brain would put two and two together, just as any reasonable dog with a big smell of a fox would nonetheless, even though it's easy, low-hanging fruit, easy pickings, the dog would yelp as hunting dogs do, right? Roll, 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 even though, as if it had made some great discovery, when in fact it was staring the dog right in the nose, or in this case, in Malvolio's eye. And sure enough, this great moment for the acting of it, M. Malvolio! Okay, hold for a laugh, right? M, to the audience, why, that begins my name. As if the audience had, of course, had been there a little while ago. And then Fabian said, did I not tell you he would work it out? The cur, again, the dog reference, is excellent at faults. A fault is another word from hunting for a cold scent. M, says Malvolio, but then there is no consonancy in the sequel. That suffers under probation. So it says the AOI doesn't follow correctly. A should follow, mal, but O does. And then Fabian comes in and says, and O shall end, I hope. And probably the image there is the O of a hangman's noose. So they're throwing in these satirical, sarcastic comments that the audience is hearing, but of course Malvolio doesn't, which is the great ridiculousness of the scene. It's completely over the top, which is why it is one of the great, great comic scenes, because the audience is actually a participant in the scene. And then Sir Toby pipes up and says, yeah, or I'll cudgel him and make him cry, oh, another pun on the word oh. And then Malvolio throws up another tennis ball, if you will, and then I comes behind. Then punning on the word I, E-Y-E, I, and you had an I behind you, you might see more detraction at your heels than fortunes before you. So if you saw if you could see all those things coming behind you, including us, you would see more than good fortune ahead of you, because there ain't gonna be any. So Malvolio again, M-O-A-I. No, this simulation is not as the former. And yet, and here's where his will, he wants to believe it, and yet to crush this a little, it would bow to me, for every one of these letters are in my name. Soft again. Here follows prose. So now he says to you, now it's written in prose. If this fall into thy hand, revolve. Okay, so this is a bit of comic business that has been passed down probably for 400 years, and you can imagine what it is. Revolve, the meaning is, revolve, turn it over in your mind, right? Think about it. So one way to play this is Malvolio goes, if this fall into thy hand, revolve. And with a sense of, okay, the actor then turns around on the stage, and we may get a little something with that little bit of jest. Now, you may think that's cheesy. You may think that's cheesy. You would not be wrong. But what's cheesy and what is a cliche is because it's true. Those of you of a certain age may remember the Dick Van Dyke Show. And you may remember an episode where Dick was I believe he was trying to win a contest by staying awake for 24 hours at a radio station, yeah? And he was there, and he's doing, he's reading the commercials and everything. And he picks up the piece of paper and he says, and now, of course, he's been awake for like 18 hours, right? So and now, let's turn to the news. It's the same joke 400 years later. Anyway, it's good because it's funny. That's why. It's funny. All right, we'll keep going here. Greatness. Some are born great, and the famous lines, of course, some achieve greatness and some have greatness thrust upon them. Thy fates open thy hands, let thy blood and spirit embrace them, and to inure thyself to what thou art like to be, cast thy humble slough and appear fresh. Let thy tongue be opposite with a kinsman. So all of these things are things that Malvolio now thinks of, Olivia wants him to do. Be opposite with a kinsman, and we see him be that with Sir Toby. Surly with servants, which he is. Go, you are not worth my, whatever it is, he says to Maria. Let thy tongue tang arguments of state. She wants him to speak about important items. Put thyself into the trick of singularity. Be unique, be unlike anyone else in your dress, in your manner. So in other words, be ridiculous. And that's what will happen to him. Remember who commended thy yellow stockings and wished to see thee ever cross-gartered. I say remembered. So here's the famous yellow stockings and cross-gartered. And it turns out that cross-gartering is actually something that a youthful, virile young man might do. It's a fashion for a young man. So again, when Malvolio appears that way, he looks yet the more ridiculous. And as we learn later, yellow is a color that Olivia does not like at all. So when he appears, he is made completely ridiculous. And the audience, of course, is joining in the laughter. Go, thou art made, if thou desirest to be so. If not, let me see thee a steward still. And if you're reading it, you're playing it, it goes, if not, let me see thee a steward still. And so absolute proof, it's to him, Olivia loves him, and on we go. She that would alter services with thee would serve you. And we have a lovely moment at the end when Orsino says to Viola, thou shalt be thy master's mistress. And they exchange the status at the end when Viola puts her dress back on. But here, she that would alter services with thee, the fortunate unhappy, he throws up his arms to the audience and says, daylight and champagne discovers not more. Champagne from a French word meaning open country. So it's daylight, I can see for miles. This is as clear as it can be. He has a long speech here, which in the interests of time, we will go through, and she drives me into the habit. I will be strange, stout, and in yellow stockings, cross-gartered, even with the swiftness of putting on. So he's going to do everything that she wants him to do. And of course, the audience and Toby and Fabian and Sir Andrew are hearing this. Jove and my stars be praised. And he starts to go off. And this is a great comic bit. It's the false exit. Those of you who saw our 2017 know that I started off with this. And when I teach this kind of thing, I call it the Columbo, right? Because Peter Falk as Columbo, he's going. And then he says, just one more thing. So this is a Columbo, right? And so the swiftness of putting on, Jove and my stars be praised. And he starts off and then comes back and says, here is yet a postscript. I remembered the day in rehearsal when I came back on and the three guys were there and they were right in front of the chaise lounges. And of course, since I had surprised them, what they did was they threw up the chaise lounges and threw up the cushions on the chaises. Completely ridiculous comedy, right? Marx Brothers stuff. And ducked under the chaise lounges. And of course, I did not notice that they were there. And then Malvolio says, I will. If thou entertainst my love, let it appear in thy smiling. Thy smiles become thee well, therefore in my presence still smile. Dear my sweet, I prithee, Jove, I thank thee, I will smile. I will do everything that thou wilt have me. And there's a moment, a lovely moment of somebody who never smiles, cracking that, practicing how maybe to smile. And that, of course, is a lovely comic moment as well, shared between the audience and Malvolio. And at that point, he runs off, and we're done. So thank you. I think that'll take us through that scene tonight. So, Vivienne, come on back.
Well, hello. There's a question that came in that is more of an overview question.
Sure.
Everyone, please send questions into the chat now. But I did have one of my own just pertaining to this before I asked that one, which is you're explaining so much in this scene that is so funny in just like great jokes, right? But so often when we see this scene done now, we're not paying attention to the language because we're watching the shenanigans. And I just wonder, do you think that's because we wouldn't understand these jokes, that you just took 40 minutes to kind of go through the words and the language? Is that why that's happened? Or has that, you know, I'm just curious why that has occurred. Do you think we could get the jokes?
I think we, the ones that are truly obscure with references that are now arcane, that we simply wouldn't know. We wouldn't get the specifics of the joke, but we would know the intention behind it, and that should be enough. Oftentimes, and I think those who saw our 2017 production, the shenanigans of the three guys can get pretty extreme. And if you're playing Malvolio, the trick is how to get the audience's attention back.
Mm.
And one of the ways to do that is actually to come in under. And I remember I noticed this when I saw The Death of a Salesman on Broadway, the Dustin Hoffman with John Malkovich playing Biff. John was speaking just a little quieter than everybody else. And so when he spoke as an audience member, you would lean forward to hear what he was saying. And so a way of getting the audience's attention back is to come in under rather than trying to shout over, to give them a chance to come back to you. So your point is well taken. And you know that if you wanted to cut this scene a little bit, it would be a tragedy, but it could be cut a little bit. You could cut some of those birding and hunting references. As I said, though, that line "Souter will," that will never survive unless you're doing on purpose an uncut version, because nobody would understand that. But you sure get the idea that this guy is being spied on and they're saying nasty things to him in this ridiculous manner.
Yeah. Wendy Waugh asked if audiences in Shakespeare's time actually really did get all the references.
Oh, I think they would. Yeah, because again, birds, everything to do with birds, flowers, animals, hunting, bear baiting, any of these subjects would be very widely known. And they would also get from the references and the kinds of images that the characters are using, they would know who these characters are. Mm-hmm. Fabian clearly is a guy who's used to working with animals. He's used to doing rough work, honest, like an honest tradesman kind of guy. And you would get that if you were of that period. Yeah, so I think so. I think they would get all of those.
Mm. So this is a broader question that's come from Richard Smith. Could you explain why there are 3 editions of Shakespeare's plays from the same publisher? And how has our understanding of Shakespeare changed since the 1920s?
Sure. Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, first of all, it depends on the play. We start with the folio version in 1623, which was some of actors from Shakespeare's company got together and said, hey, you know what, he was pretty good. We ought to put all those, we ought to get like an authoritative version out. So they got all the scripts they could find, and there was some process by which they put those scripts together into what we call the First Folio. And there were about 200 of them in the world that were printed and still exist. The Folger Shakespeare Library in Washington has 70, I think, and some odd. There was one on tour recently that came to the History Museum in Raleigh that you could go and look at. And when I was in Washington, I went to see those first editions. But so that's one. And there are people who swear by you have to use only the folio version of the text. But no, because like that reading tonight, Stallion versus, well, I've lost the word, but the other word which had the reference to the bird. And you could change it to another bird like the hawk or something like that, and the image would work. These papers that were put together were from all over. They were from stage managers' prompt books, and they were from what we would call the quarto versions, which were literally a big piece of printing paper folded once in half and then twice to make quarters, hence the quarto. If they are folded again into a smaller book, they are called octavo, after 8. So you get 8 from each page. And those quartos were sold, scholars differ on the purpose behind them, and how they came about. We know in Hamlet that there are more lines in the second quarto than actually appear in the folio. So did the quarto come out first, and the folio shows how they cut the play when they did it. And then you have with Hamlet, you have certainly at least 2 quartos on the folio. With some plays, there are first, second, and third quartos, and there are also other folios that came out later. That you have the second folio, the third folio, which are different editions. So that is all. If you're directing the play or if you are acting in the play, you want to know what all those different variants are so that you can do your best to make the most sense, both for yourself, but also for the audience. Oh, and the larger question, 1920 to now. We are much more likely to play the text, certainly to use less pageantry, in that to simplify our productions and focus more on the text in a very simple way. This was, of course, Peter Brooke in 1968. In his famous production of Midsummer Night's Dream that takes place in a white box and a trapeze, and the whole thing happens there. It used to be an excuse for a long night in the theater with lots of choruses, almost like an operatic chorus that would happen. If there's a big court scene, you'd have 50 supernumeraries, and they were much larger. And we also have more accurate text for ourselves to use. This change really started with a man named William Pole in England in, I believe, the 1880s, who was the first to move back to the original Shakespeare. You know, Lincoln was said that he preferred to read the plays than to go see them. And we believe the reason for that is that he never got to see what Shakespeare wrote. He always got to see the rewritten plays that happened in the Victorian era in particular, which took out all the bawdy stuff. And in the 18th century, they rewrote for happy endings. So at the end of King Lear, Nahum Tate famously did a rewrite where Edgar marries Cordelia at the end, and everybody lives. And so Lincoln, no fool he, said that he preferred to read it because he actually preferred Shakespeare to this thing that was happening in the theaters.
These adaptations, essentially.
Broad adaptations. And during the Victorian age, of course, several lines from the scene we just saw probably didn't make it into a production of Twelfth Night.
Not to put you on the spot, Ray, but how do you feel about the current sort of phase of adaptations of Shakespeare?
I'm split on it because I believe the more Shakespeare out there, because the stories will survive the adaptations, the structure of the stories. will survive, and that's important. And they could serve as a gateway. If someone is interested, they might then want to go back and look at the original. But the other part of me that is a traditionalist, and I probably no big surprise, I am, and I've been studying Shakespeare for 50 years. Yeah. And I believe that if the actor knows what he or she is saying and is attempting to get something back from the person he or she is saying it to, that the audience will, even if they don't know what the word means, they will understand the context and they will understand the humanity that is being portrayed. Mm-hmm. And so that's my mixed answer.
Yeah, no, I think I've felt similarly to you on that. Brian asked a question related to this, actually. He says, what hope have we to understand the nuances of properly appreciate Shakespeare without taking a semester-long class on it? And he wrote 15 to 20, can we please start and come to your next class? That is a lovely comment, but it's true. If you choose to take it apart, it's a wonderfully bottomless pit.
It is. Well, it's what we would call something that a friend of mine, Frank Dwyer, who became the dramaturg at the Mark Taper many years after we worked together in New York. Frank had a way with words, and he said that Shakespeare rewards the stayer, S-T-A-Y-E-R. That, as Viv just said, it's something that you can spend your entire life on, if you wish, studying. Mm-hmm. And those things like opera, cooking. Think about those things that can be lifetime pursuits. For me, baseball has been that. The Shakespeare, when I teach it, the metaphor I use is with students that we are arriving on Shakespeare Island, and we're going to cut out a little beachhead for ourselves. And just so we're familiar with this little piece of ground, and every time we work on something, we're just clearing a little more ground. We're clearing a little more ground. And I remind them that I'm sort of like a guide. I've been over most of the island, but I haven't been over all of it. I know the way to some places really well. But that's really the metaphor, is that you can go back to Shakespeare Island the rest of your life and clear a little more ground. And now we, of course, have great videos as well as written text that we can explore and see the take. Just because it dropped into my head, the Simon Russell Beale, King Lear, there are some scenes on YouTube that it was like, oh my God, yes, that. And so our job is to be as not faithful, but as effective as we can with these wonderful plays.
Other than watching you, who are your favorite Shakespearean actors to watch on film now, on film or were on stage? And that, and because we're dealing with a comedy, I'm sort of curious to ask you about that in the comedies. Yeah,
the great comic actors. I'm thinking about that. Well, I'll snapshot the version of Twelfth Night that the BBC did in the 1980s. I believe Jonathan Miller directed it, but Felicity Kendall as Viola, Sinead Cusack as Olivia, Alec McCowran as Malvolio. I mean, seriously good stuff. My own favorite actors here in America are, and many of them are friends of mine. Somebody that you haven't heard of, oh, I know, Viv, you have, because you've worked with him, but Sam Chuchuvas. Oh. He was in the first class at Juilliard, along with Patti LuPone and Kevin Kline. Of course, Kevin is extraordinary. Denzel Washington is extraordinary. Mm-hmm. He's a fellow alum of mine from ACT, the great, a lot of great actors from there. But that Juilliard class and the following classes who had Elizabeth Smith for their voice and speech, and Houseman and Michel Saint-Denis, all these great these great, great, great teachers. And of course, Viv at NYU with Mark Wing Davey and Zelda, your great mentor. Sam is still in 1976 at the Utah Shakespeare Festival. I first met Sam and he was playing Brutus. He was playing Stefano in The Tempest, and he was playing Holofernes in Love's Labour's Lost. And that Holofernes, which he based on, I think it's okay to say this now, it's 50 years later or 40 years later, he based it on the resident scholar there at the festival. It was the funniest thing I had ever seen until we opened The Tempest and I saw Sam Stefano. And it was howlingly funny. And so a tribute to Sam, who is still with us and mostly does theater and voiceovers.
Yeah.
Because of that magnificent vocal instrument that he has. But those, Denzel Washington and his daughter, oh my goodness, Olivia, recently on Great Performances, I don't know if I mentioned this last time, but there was a Much Ado, and Olivia had Margaret. She was playing Margaret, a secondary role. But boy, she had this one speech that she just did beautifully. So it clearly runs in the family there.
Well,
so anyway, long answer.
Well, thank you. I mean, I was just curious on that because I think it is appropriate to say that for we that are lucky enough to get to see you on stage or share this time with you, you are right up there with the very best that I've ever encountered in my life. And I think many of us share that opinion. So we are very blessed to have you. And again, thank you for another amazing class. We look forward to next month. So stay tuned. And we are changing to Tuesday nights, just so people know. So thank you for adjusting with us all. And, you know, in closing, I will just say that if you love Shakespeare, you may not think that you'd love Temples of Lung and Air, but actually you will, and you should, because Kate Smigo as a spoken word poet is doing very similar things for today that Shakespeare was doing in his age, and really,
Kane's really good.
Really, really good. So I hope that you will be joining us. It only streams for 2 weeks from September 28th to October 11th. And we've got some really interesting talks planned on October 11th on the closing day of that as well. So I hope to see you there and throughout the season. And as you know, as I say every time, if you are able to make a donation to PlayMakers, it is so appreciated at this time. No gift too small, no gift too large, helping us make sure that we can come back when we do come back, and we will, to do what we're doing on our stages. So until next time, thank you. Thank you, Ray. Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful rest of the week. Stay safe.
Bye.